The gun was already pressed against Robert Abbott's temple when Rose Keller walked through the saloon doors. She had not come to Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1882 to watch a man die. She had come for her brother. She had come because Thomas Keller had written 3 letters and then gone silent, and silence from Thomas had always meant trouble since the day he was born. But the moment she stepped through those swinging doors, the stench of whiskey and gun smoke hitting her like a fist, she forgot about Thomas entirely. The man on his knees in the center of the room was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and bleeding from a cut above his left eye. His hands were tied behind him with rough rope. 3 men stood around him in a loose circle, and the largest of them had a Colt single-action Army revolver pressed to his skull. The room was perfectly, terrifyingly silent. Rose did not scream. She had been raised on a hard-luck farm in Ohio, and she had learned early that screaming was a luxury she could not afford. What she did was walk forward. "Enough," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her more than anyone else in the room. The man with the gun turned. He had small eyes set deep in a face like a weathered cliff, and he looked at her the way men in the territory had been looking at her since she stepped off the stage 3 days ago, like she was something that had wandered into the wrong country. "Lady," he said, "you need to turn yourself right back around." "I will not," Rose said. She kept her eyes on the man kneeling in the center of the floor, and he was looking at her too now, those dark eyes sharp and calculating even with a gun against his head, even bleeding, even clearly in the worst position a man could find himself in. "I am looking for Thomas Keller. Someone in this room knows where he is. And I am not leaving until I find out." The man with the gun laughed. It was not a kind laugh. But the kneeling man, later she would learn his name, would learn that it was Robert Abbott, and that learning his name would change everything. Tilted his head very slightly to the right and looked at the far wall, and Rose, who had always been good at reading what people could not say aloud, looked where he looked. She saw the back door. She saw the shadow moving behind it. She saw the boots beneath the crack. She said, "Thomas Keller, if you are standing behind that door, you walk through it right now." The silence stretched. Then the door opened, and her brother came through it with his hands raised, and the entire situation unwound from there in a way that she would spend years trying to fully explain. She had arrived in the territory looking for Thomas. She had not known, when she stepped onto that stage in Cincinnati, that she would find anything else. But in the months that followed, in the dangerous and beautiful and terrible months of 1882 and into 1883, what she found was a life she had not known to want. And it began with a man on his knees who looked at her like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Rose Keller had boarded the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad in Cincinnati on the 14th of March, 1882, with one leather traveling bag, $42 in folded bills tucked into her boot, and the last letter Thomas had sent her clutched in her coat pocket. She was 24 years old, and she had never been west of Indiana. She read the letter so many times between Ohio and Kansas that the creases wore through, and she had to handle it gently like something precious, though the words themselves were anything but. Thomas had written, "I am in some trouble, Rosie. Come if you can. Do not tell Mother. I am in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, working for a man named Fletcher. There is money here, but something is not right. Come if you can. I mean it." That was all. 3 weeks later, nothing. 4 weeks, nothing. 5 weeks, and Rose had packed her bag and bought her ticket and told her mother she was visiting a cousin in St. Louis. The train took her to Trinidad, Colorado. The stage took her the rest of the way south into New Mexico Territory, rattling down through the mountain passes and onto the high plains, and Rose had pressed her face to the dust-caked window and tried to understand what she was looking at. The land was enormous. It dwarfed every idea she had ever had about space and distance. The sky alone was bigger than Ohio, big and blue, and so ruthlessly bright that it hurt to look at it directly. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose to the west like something out of scripture, and the grasslands rolled, and Rose felt for the first time in her adult life, genuinely small. Cimarron was a town of perhaps 500 souls at the edge of the Cimarron River, and it had the look of a place that had grown up too fast and was not sure yet what it wanted to be. There was a main street of packed dirt, a scattering of adobe buildings alongside wooden storefronts, a hotel, a post office, two saloons, a blacksmith, a dry goods store, and a church that looked like it was losing a slow argument with the wind. The St. James Hotel was the finest establishment in town, and Rose took a room there because it was also the safest, and she was not a fool. She had spent 3 days asking quiet questions in the wrong places before Thomas's name brought her to the door of the Silver Bell Saloon on a Wednesday afternoon, and she walked in and found Robert Abbott on his knees, and her whole carefully organized mission scattered like cards in a wind. After the confrontation, after the man with the gun, whose name was Deke Harmon, had backed down under the combined pressure of Thomas's sudden appearance, and the strange new variable of a woman in a gray traveling dress who showed no signs of leaving, after all of that had settled into a tense and uncomfortable standoff, Robert Abbott stood up from the floor, blood drying on his face, and held out his hand to Rose. "Robert Abbott," he said. "I am obliged to you, Miss Keller," she said. "Rose Keller. Thomas is my brother." He looked at Thomas, who was standing in the corner looking young and frightened and guilty of several things he had not yet confessed to. Then he looked back at Rose. "You came all the way from Ohio," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been listening during her exchange with Harmon. "I did," she said. "That was a brave and extremely ill-advised thing to do," he said. "I am aware," she said. "What is your connection to my brother?" Robert Abbott was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate when they could, and he had the kind of face that held its expression carefully, like it had learned that giving things away was dangerous. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw shadowed with several days of growth, and those eyes, dark brown and direct, that had looked at her across a saloon floor with a gun at his head, and said things he could not say aloud. He was the deputy sheriff of Cimarron. This information did not entirely reassure Rose, because her experience of law in the territory had already taught her that a badge was not automatically a promise of safety. But it explained certain things about why Deke Harmon and his men had eventually backed down, and it told her that Robert Abbott had some authority in this town, and authority was something she needed. Thomas's trouble, as it unfolded over the following hour in a back room of the St. James Hotel, with Robert Abbott present at Rose's insistence, and Thomas looking increasingly like he wished the floor would simply open and consume him, was both worse and more specific than she had feared. Thomas Keller had come to Cimarron 6 months earlier at the age of 22, answering a broadside advertisement for ranch hands on the Cimarron Grant lands. The man who had hired him was Warren Fletcher, who ran a large cattle operation in the foothills west of town, and who was, as Thomas had correctly intuited in his letter, not entirely what he appeared to be. Fletcher was running cattle across the territorial boundary and altering brands, a crime serious enough to earn a man federal prison time, and Thomas, in the naive and hopeful way of young men who need money and ask too few questions, had been present for enough of it to be considered an accessory. But the worst part, the part that made Rose's stomach drop and her hands clench in her lap, was that Thomas had taken money. Not knowing at first what it was for, and then knowing and taking it anyway because he was in debt and frightened and very far from home. "You took a bribe," Rose said flatly. Thomas said nothing, which was its own answer. Robert Abbott sat across the table with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral, and Rose looked at him and said, "What happens to him?" "That depends," Robert Abbott said, "on what he is willing to do about it." What Thomas was willing to do, it turned out, was testify. Fletcher was a man the territorial marshal's office had been watching for 2 years, and Thomas's testimony about the brand alterations and the transport routes, and the names of the men involved, was the kind of specific, first-hand account that could break the case open. Robert Abbott had been investigating Fletcher quietly for 8 months. Thomas's information was valuable. And Deke Harmon, who worked for Fletcher and who had been applying a certain kind of pressure to ensure Thomas's silence, was the reason Thomas had been hiding behind a door in the Silver Bell Saloon rather than walking openly in the street. "He threatened him," Rose said. "Yes," Robert Abbott said. "He threatened my brother to keep him from talking." "That is correct." Rose looked at Thomas, who was staring at the table, and she felt the full, complicated weight of loving someone who had made poor choices and was in genuine danger and was still, underneath all of it, her little brother, the boy she had taught to read, the boy she had taken care of when their father's drinking made taking care of things necessary. "Then we are going to make sure he talks," she said. Robert Abbott looked at her with that careful, measured expression, and something shifted in it. Something small that she would not have caught if she had not been paying close attention, which she always was. "Miss Keller," he said, "this is not a situation you need to involve yourself in further. Your brother is under my protection. I can arrange for you to take the next stage back north and—" "No," she said. He stopped. "I will not be taking the next stage anywhere," she said. "I came here to see my brother safe, and safe means I am here to see it through. I have $42 and a room at the St. James and nowhere pressing to be. Tell me what needs to happen." The silence that followed was not a hostile one. It was more like the silence of a man recalibrating. "You are a very determined woman," he said. "Yes," she said, "I am." He studied her for another moment. Then he nodded once and said, "All right, here is what needs to happen." Rose had not expected to like Cimarron. She had not expected to like anything about this errand except its conclusion. But the territory had a way of getting under the skin before a person noticed it happening, and in the days that followed, as Robert Abbott moved quietly and carefully around the Fletcher investigation, and Thomas stayed close to the hotel under an arrangement that could charitably be called protective custody, Rose found herself walking the town in the sharp spring mornings and finding it not entirely without appeal. The light was extraordinary. That was the first thing. The light in New Mexico territory in April was like nothing she had ever experienced. It came down clear and hard and bright, with a quality that made everything look freshly made, and the shadows it threw were deep and precise. She had brought a small sketchbook from Ohio, a habit from girlhood, and she found herself filling pages with the shapes of the mountains and the angular shadows of the adobe buildings and the enormous sweep of the sky. She also found herself in the early evenings, sitting in the lobby of the St. James Hotel when Robert Abbott came in from his rounds, and talking to him. This happened the first time by accident. She was writing a letter to her mother at the small writing desk near the front window, and he came through the door, took off his hat, and said good evening in a tone that expected nothing in return, and she said good evening back. And he sat down in the chair across from her and said, "How is your brother today?" And she said, "Frightened but stable." And he said, "Good." And then instead of leaving he stayed, and they talked for an hour about nothing consequential, about the history of the Maxwell land grant and the dispute over its boundaries, about the railroad coming through, about Ohio, which he had never seen but had heard about from a man he'd ridden with years ago. And when she finally went upstairs to bed, she lay awake for a while thinking about his voice, which was quiet and precise, like someone who had learned to measure words carefully. The second evening conversation was less accidental. She was waiting in the lobby, and she knew she was waiting, and she did not examine that knowledge too closely. He sat down and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "I generally do," she said. "Does your brother have any documentation, letters, ledgers, anything written down from his time working for Fletcher?" Rose felt something tighten in her chest. "Why?" "Because Harmon came to see me today," he said, and what he said was friendly and polite and entirely threatening. "Fletcher knows Thomas is talking to me. The physical testimony is valuable, but it is also vulnerable, because a man can be frightened into recanting. Written evidence cannot recant." Thomas mentioned letters, Rose said carefully. From Fletcher, instructing him on specific deliveries. He said he kept them. Robert Abbott went very still. Where? He did not say. I did not push. I will talk to him. Miss Keller, Robert said, and then he paused, and something in the pause was heavier than the words that had come before it. I need you to understand that what I am asking you to do involves some real danger. If Harmon's people know those letters exist and they think you have them or know where they are, I understand, she said. I do not think you fully, Mr. Abbott, she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. I left Ohio alone on a train. I rode a stage through 3 days of mountains. I walked into a saloon and told a man with a gun to stop, and he did. I understand danger. What I need from you is not protection from the facts. What I need is for you to trust me to handle what I can handle. Another silence. Longer this time. You are right, he said. I apologize. She had not expected the apology. It disarmed her entirely. She sat for a moment, breathing slowly, and then she said, "Thank you," and he nodded, and they looked at each other across the lobby of the St. James Hotel in the lamplight, and Rose felt something in her chest that she had not felt before, something warm and frightening and inconvenient. She thought, this is not why I came here, but she did not leave. Thomas had the letters hidden under a loose floorboard in his room, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, the way a man hides something when he is simultaneously ashamed of it and aware that it might save his life. There were 7 of them in Fletcher's hand, specific and damning, and precisely what Robert Abbott had hoped for. Rose brought them to him the next morning in an envelope, and when he opened them and read them, the careful expression shifted, and she saw something underneath it, something that was nearly relief, something that looked briefly like a man who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had just been told he could set part of it down. "These are enough," he said. "Enough for what?" "To bring this to the federal circuit judge when he comes through next month," Robert said. "Enough to put Fletcher away and immunize Thomas from prosecution in exchange for his testimony." "Thomas will be safe," Rose said. "If we keep him safe until the judge arrives," Robert said. "That is 5 weeks, Miss Keller. 5 weeks during which Harmon and Fletcher's people will be applying whatever pressure they think might work." "Then we keep him safe for 5 weeks," Rose said. Robert looked at her and said very quietly, "You are planning to stay." It was not a question. He had read her by then, she realized. He had been reading her the way she had been reading him, quietly and carefully, and he had arrived at the same conclusion she had. "I am planning to stay," she said. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I should tell you something about this town, about me." She waited. "I have been here 4 years," he said. "I came because it was far from where I had been, and far was what I needed. I have made enemies in this work, not just Fletcher. There are men in this territory who would be happy to see me unable to do my job. If you stay close to me and close to Thomas, you become a target by association." "That is the most oblique threat assessment I have ever been given," Rose said. He blinked. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It transformed his face completely. The careful, measured expression broke open, and what was underneath was warm and slightly surprised, like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to find something genuinely funny. "I am trying to give you the opportunity to make an informed decision," he said. "I appreciate it," she said. "I am staying." The smile faded back into something softer, something that was not quite the careful mask and was not quite the open warmth, but something in between, something new that she suspected he was feeling his way through just as she was. "All right," he said. "Then I should show you a few things." He showed her where the sheriff's office was, and told her to go there if she was ever in difficulty, and he was not available. He introduced her to his deputy, a young Tejano man named Ernesto Villarreal, who had been born in the territory and knew every face in Cimarron by name, and who shook Rose's hand with formal courtesy and said, "Your brother has talked about you, Miss Keller. He said you were formidable. I believe now that he was understating." Rose said, "Tell him I said so." Ernesto laughed. Robert showed her the back routes through town, the alleys and the cut-throughs, and the pathways behind the hotel that connected to the river walk. He did this without drama, walking beside her in the afternoon light, pointing and explaining in his quiet voice, and Rose listened and memorized and felt the strange doubled quality of the moment. The practical necessity of learning these routes, and underneath it, the warmth of walking beside him, the awareness of the distance between their arms, the way he occasionally paused and turned to make sure she had understood, and the way she felt each time his eyes found hers. She thought, I should not be thinking about this. She thought it, and then she kept walking beside him, and she did not stop thinking about it. The first serious threat came on a Thursday evening in the second week of her stay. Rose was coming back from the dry goods store with a paper-wrapped parcel of thread and a book she had talked Mr. Brennan at the store into ordering for her, a novel she had been wanting, which had arrived the previous week from the East, when two men she did not recognize fell into step behind her on the main street. She noticed them the way Robert had taught her to notice things, peripherally, without turning, marking the sound of their footsteps against the packed dirt, and the fact that they had matched her pace and altered it when she slowed. She turned at the corner, into the narrow side street that ran beside the hotel, and they followed, and that was when she moved. She did not run. Running was what they expected, and running in a skirt on uneven ground was a practical disaster. Instead, she pushed through the door of the nearest building, which happened to be the office of the Cimarron News and Press, and walked straight to the counter and said to the startled young man behind it, I need to send a message to Deputy Abbott at the sheriff's office immediately. Tell him Rose Keller says there are two men following her on 5th Street. Can you do that? The young man, to his credit, said, Yes, ma'am, and was out the back door before the two men outside had finished deciding whether to come in after her. They did not come in. She stood at the counter and read the notices pinned to the board and waited, and 8 minutes later Robert walked through the front door of the News and Press with his hand resting on the grip of his Colt, and his expression set in a way that she had not seen before, tight and focused and entirely ready. He looked at her. She was standing calmly reading a notice about a cattlemen's meeting. Are you all right? He said. Perfectly, she said. They were outside, but I expect they have gone by now. He checked. They had gone. He came back and stood in front of her and said, You handled that well. You taught me well, she said, or you showed me what to do, which amounts to the same thing. It is not the same thing, he said. You made the right choices under pressure. That is not teaching, that is character. She looked at him steadily, and he looked back at her, and the distance between them was very small, and the young man from the News and Press was pretending to arrange type at his compositing table with the focused intensity of someone who was very deliberately not watching what was happening in the front of his office. Rose said, Thank you for coming. Always, Robert said, and then seemed to hear what he had said, and a faint color came up in his face, which was the first time she had seen him caught off balance, and it was, she thought, possibly the most appealing thing she had ever seen. She did not say so. She walked back to the hotel with him beside her, and they did not speak much, and the silence between them had an entirely different quality from the silence she had encountered when she arrived. It was warm and taut and aware, and it was, she realized, the silence of two people who were keeping things carefully unsaid. She told Thomas about the men that evening, and he went pale and said, Rose, you should go home. No, she said. This is my mess, he said. I got myself into it, and you should not be. Thomas, she said. Listen to me carefully. I am not here because I think you cannot manage your own affairs. I am here because you are my brother and you sent for me, and I love you. And I am staying because there is now a case that needs making and a judge who needs things to be intact when he arrives, and I intend to see that happen. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, You are different here. What do you mean? At home, he said, you were the responsible one. You held everything together, but here you are, he searched for the word. Here you are alive, in a way I have not seen before. Rose did not answer. She looked out the window at the Cimarron Mountains in the last light and thought about the word he had used, alive, and felt the truth of it like something physical, like the land itself pressing up through the soles of her feet. She thought about Robert Abbott. She thought, This is not why I came here. But she also thought, perhaps it does not matter why I came. Perhaps what matters is that I am here. She spent part of the following week at the sheriff's office, at Robert's suggestion, helping Ernesto organize the documentation of the Fletcher case into a coherent file for the circuit judge. She had a clear hand and a methodical mind, and the task suited her. Ernesto treated her as a colleague from the first hour, explaining what each document represented and what gaps still needed filling, and Rose found that she understood the shape of the case the way she understood patterns in fabric. It was a matter of seeing what was there and what was missing, and what needed to connect to what. Robert came and went throughout the day, doing his rounds, handling the ordinary business of keeping order in a town that was never entirely peaceful. And each time he came through the door, he looked at her first before anything else, and she noticed that, and she looked away before he could see that she had noticed. One morning he came in with his shirt sleeve rolled up and a bandage wrapped around his forearm, and Rose said, "What happened?" Before she could stop herself, and there was something in the urgency of the question that she heard even as she was asking it. He glanced at her with an expression that was not quite concealment and not quite openness. "A disagreement," he said. "With who?" "A man who has since been persuaded to find other business." "Robert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without the Mr., and they both heard it. He stopped. He looked at her. "How bad is it?" she said. "Not bad," he said. "Clean cut, already treated." "Let me see." He hesitated for just a moment, and then he crossed to her desk and sat in the chair beside it and held out his arm. She unwrapped the bandage with careful hands. She had learned basic wound care from a book and from years of dealing with a farm's inevitable injuries, and looked at the cut, which was 3 inches long on the forearm, cleaned and closed with a strip of adhesive plaster. "This needs to be kept clean," she said. "I know," he said. She rewrapped it and tied the bandage neatly and did not immediately let go of his hand, and he did not immediately take it back. And for a moment they sat like that in the small office with Ernesto elsewhere and the spring light coming through the window and the whole vast territory outside, and Rose felt the thing between them as clearly as if someone had named it aloud. She let go of his hand. He pulled it back slowly. "Thank you," he said. "You are welcome," she said, and turned back to her documents, and the sound of her own heartbeat was embarrassingly loud in her ears for the next 20 minutes. That evening he asked her if she would walk with him. It was a simple invitation, given quietly as he was leaving the hotel lobby at the end of the day, and it was simple enough that she almost did not feel the weight of it until she had already said yes, and then she felt it entirely. They walked along the Cimarron River in the long spring evening, when the light went gold and the water ran bright and cold over the stones, and the cottonwood trees along the bank were greening up, their new leaves catching the light like small flags. It was the most beautiful thing Rose had seen since arriving in the territory, and she said so. "The whole country is like this," Robert said. "Once you start looking." "Have you always looked?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "Not always. I spent some years not looking at anything. It is easier not to." She felt the shape of a hidden past in what he said and did not push. She had learned that about him, that he would say things when he was ready and not before, and that patience was the right response. "What brought you here?" she asked instead. "You said you came because it was far from where you had been." "Yes," he said. "And now, after 4 years," he looked at the river. "I came for distance. I stayed for something else." "What?" "I am not certain I had a name for it before recently," he said, and his voice was very careful, and Rose understood that they were not talking about geography anymore. She said slowly, "I told Thomas something the other evening, that it does not matter why a person arrives somewhere. What matters is that they are there." He looked at her then, full on, without the careful guard, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch because it was so open and so clear, and it said everything that neither of them had said yet. "Rose," he said. "Yes," she said, not answering a question, just acknowledging that she heard him, that she was here, that she understood. He did not kiss her, not then. He stood beside her in the river light, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said, very quietly, "I need to tell you something about my past, before this goes further, because you deserve to know it and because I will not build something new on a hidden foundation." She turned to face him. "Tell me." So he did. Robert Abbott had come west from Missouri in 1875 when he was 24. He had been a young man with a gambling habit and a temper he had not yet learned to manage, and he had made a series of choices that he described with the flat precision of someone who had made peace with the facts but not entirely with himself. He had ridden with men who were not particular about the law. He had not done the worst things those men had done, but he had been present for some of them, and presence was its own kind of complicity. He had walked away from that life in 1877, after a job in Kansas that went wrong in a way that cost 2 men their lives. He had not pulled the trigger, but he had been there, and the men who died had families, and knowing that had changed something in him permanently. He had spent 2 years doing legitimate ranch work, saving money, and working through what the minister in the small town where he stopped for a winter called a reckoning. And then he had come to Cimarron, and he had met the sheriff there, a man named Caldwell who had recognized something in him and offered him a deputy's badge, and he had taken it and been careful with it ever since. "The men I rode with are mostly gone now," he said, "dead or in prison, but my past is not a secret that can be permanently kept in a territory this connected. There are people who know what I was, and you should know it too." Rose listened to all of this. She stood by the river and listened until he was done, and then she was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Are you the man you were then?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I was him." "We are all people we were once," Rose said. "I am still the girl who pretended everything was fine in a house where nothing was fine for years because I was too frightened to say otherwise. I was her. I am not her now, but she is part of how I got here." He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she saw in them something she could only describe as gratitude, pure and unguarded. "I needed you to know," he said. "I know," she said, "and now I do, and I am still standing here." He reached out and took her hand gently and held it, and they stood by the river in the evening light, and Rose thought that she had not known what a person's hand could communicate until that moment's steadiness and gratitude, and something she was willing now to call by its right name. She did not say the name aloud, not yet, but she held his hand back firmly, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were a strange and complicated blend of danger and something that felt, improbably, like happiness. Fletcher's people were present and watchful. Deke Harmon appeared on the main street twice, both times doing nothing illegal, simply being visible, which was its own kind of message. Ernesto reported that 2 of Fletcher's ranch hands had been seen asking questions at the hotel about Thomas and Rose, and Robert tightened the informal guard on the hotel accordingly. Thomas chafed under the restriction, and Rose managed him with the combination of firmness and affection that had been her primary tool since childhood. She brought him books from the store and argued with him about their contents and played cards with him in the evenings. And she watched him slowly stop looking like a rabbit in a trap and start looking like a man who was deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. One afternoon she brought Robert a plate of food from the hotel dining room because Ernesto had mentioned that he had not eaten since breakfast, and she found him at his desk reading a law book with his brow furrowed and his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, and he looked up when she came in, and the expression that crossed his face before the careful mask had time to reassemble was so unguardedly glad that she felt warm from her hairline to her boot heels. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "Ernesto said you had not eaten. Ernesto talks too much. Ernesto is looking out for you," she said. "He is allowed." Robert looked at the plate, then at her. "Will you sit with me?" She sat. She watched him eat. It was a domestic, ordinary thing, and it was also somehow the most intimate thing that had passed between them, more intimate than the hand-holding by the river, because it was so simple and so real. She said, "What are you reading?" "Territorial land law," he said. "Fletcher's operation involves land claims that were filed fraudulently. If we can prove the fraud alongside the brand alteration, the case against him becomes substantially more complete. What do you need to prove the land fraud? Survey records that were filed with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. I have requested copies, but they have not arrived yet. Write another letter, she said. I have written two. Write a third. Be specific about the deadline and the consequence. People respond to consequence. He looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, the one that said she had said something that confirmed a calculation he had already made. You are very good at this, he said. I am very good at getting things done, she said. I have been doing it since I was 12. Because of your father, she had told him something about her father. Not everything, but the shape of it. Yes, she said. I am sorry, he said simply. Do not be sorry, she said. It made me what I am. And what I am is useful to you at this moment, so. He set down his fork and said very quietly, You are a great deal more than useful to me. The words landed precisely and with full weight, and Rose held them and felt their warmth and said, because she had promised herself she would be honest, I know. I feel the same way about you, and it frightens me somewhat because I did not come here for this. No, he agreed. And I still have a life in Ohio. My mother, my obligations. Yes. And you are here in the territory, and I do not know what I am or what I want beyond the next 5 weeks when this case concludes. Those are all true things, he said. So, she said. So, he said. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, Rose. I'm not going anywhere, and I do not think you are the kind of woman who runs from a hard question. Whenever you are ready to think about what is beyond the next 5 weeks, I will be here. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, You are a remarkably patient man. I have learned to be, he said. She smiled. It was involuntary, the kind of smile that comes before a person has decided to smile, and she saw in his face the effect it had on him. And the whole thing was so entirely different from anything she had expected when she packed her bag in Ohio that she could only shake her head slightly, amazed at the inexplicable routes life took. The survey records arrived from Santa Fe on a Tuesday, 2 weeks before the circuit judge was due to come through, and they were, as Robert had hoped, damning. 3 of the land parcels under the Fletcher operation had been filed using false boundary surveys, encroaching on land that belonged legally to smaller homesteaders who had been quietly pressured to abandon their claims. One of those homesteaders, a man named Augustin Reyes, who had farmed a small plot by the river for 15 years, had relocated his family to Taos after 2 of his outbuildings were burned, and his cattle were found shot. Rose read through the Reyes file with a cold, growing anger that she recognized as the same fury that had been with her all her life, the fury at people who used power to grind down those who had less of it. She thought of her father, who had been a small man in all the ways that mattered, grinding down what was beneath him because he had no power over what was above. She thought of Deke Harmon with his gun and his small eyes. She thought of Warren Fletcher, whom she had not yet seen but who had acquired a very specific shape in her mind, the shape of a man who believed his money made him untouchable. We should go to Taos, she said to Robert. We should get Augustin Reyes's testimony. The judge will accept documentary evidence of the land fraud, Robert said. Documentary evidence is one thing, Rose said. A man describing what was done to his family is another. Juries are made of men who understand what it means to protect a home, give them a face to attach to the crime. He looked at her for a long moment. You are right, he said, but Taos is 2 days' ride from here. I cannot leave Cimarron for 4 days with Thomas still here and Harmon watching. Send Ernesto, Rose said. He speaks Spanish, which I assume Mr. Reyes might be more comfortable with, and he knows the road south. Robert said slowly, That is a good plan. I know, she said. He almost smiled. Your confidence in your own judgment is one of the more remarkable things I have encountered in this territory. My confidence in my judgment is the only reliable thing I brought from Ohio, she said. I intend to keep it. Ernesto went to Taos and came back 3 days later with Augustin Reyes's sworn statement, 5 pages of testimony in Spanish that Ernesto had translated into English in a clear, careful hand. It detailed the burns, the shot cattle, the visits from men who worked for Fletcher, the implicit threats, and the day Reyes had put his wife and 4 children into a wagon and driven away from land that had been his father's. Rose read it twice and felt the anger settle into something harder and more useful. She filed the statement with the rest of the case documentation and said nothing for a while, and Robert, who had been watching her read, said, "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that when this is over," Rose said, "Augustin Reyes should have his land back." "That is a civil matter for the territorial court," Robert said. "Then the territorial court should hear about it," Rose said. "Do you know anyone?" He looked at her. "I know a lawyer in Santa Fe." "Write to him," she said. There was a pause. Then he said very quietly, "Rose, what? You are doing something larger than what you came here to do." She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I am." "Is that all right with you?" She looked around the small office, at the files and the land records, and the sworn statements stacked on the desk, at the window showing the mountains in the afternoon light, at him. "More than all right," she said. The night before the circuit judge arrived, Fletcher made his move. Rose had expected something. She had known for a week that the window was closing and that Fletcher was not a man who would accept defeat through legal process without attempting some other option. She had been careful beyond what she had known she could be, and she had made sure Thomas was careful. She had not been careful enough. It was Ernesto who found the note slipped under Thomas's door sometime after midnight, written in a hand that was not Harmon's and not Fletcher's but someone hired for the purpose. It said, "Leave Cimarron before morning. The testimony will not change what is coming for you. Take your sister and go." Thomas brought the note to Rose's room at 3 in the morning, white-faced, and she read it twice. And then she put on her coat and her boots and went down the hall and knocked on Robert's door, because he had taken a room at the hotel for the last 2 weeks of the case rather than sleeping at the office. And he opened the door in 30 seconds, already dressed, because she suspected he had not been sleeping either. She showed him the note. He read it. His jaw tightened. He said, "Thomas stays in this room." "You stay in this room, lock the door." "Where are you going?" "Harmon has a room at the other hotel," he said. "I'm going to have a conversation with him that I should have had 2 weeks ago." "Robert," she said. He looked at her. "Be careful," she said. He touched her face briefly with the back of 2 fingers, the first time he had touched her face, and it was so light and so deliberate that she felt it long after he had gone. He came back 90 minutes later with Deke Harmon in handcuffs and a bruise forming on his left cheekbone that had not been there before. Harmon was charged with intimidation of a witness and was locked in the Cimarron jail, and Fletcher, when he heard this at dawn, made the decision that broke his case open entirely. He tried to run. He was arrested 2 miles south of town by Ernesto and 2 men from the town marshal's office. He had 2 saddlebags of cash and a set of papers that turned out to be forged land titles for properties in Colorado. The cash and the titles were added to the evidence file with the serene tidiness of things falling into their right place. Rose was standing on the porch of the St. James Hotel when they brought Fletcher through town, and she looked at him, a square-built man of 50 in a good coat, his face arranged in an expression of contemptuous calm that she recognized as the expression of a man who had not yet understood that the ground had shifted, and she felt nothing particular. Not triumph, not anger, just the quiet satisfaction of a thing resolved. Thomas came to stand beside her and she took his arm and he leaned into her slightly, the way he had when he was small, and she leaned back. "It is almost done," she said. "Almost," he said. "Rosie, I know. I am sorry," he said, "for putting you in the middle of this." "You did not put me anywhere," she said. "I put myself here. There is a difference." The circuit judge, a trim man named Judge Hartley from the federal court in Santa Fe, arrived the next day on the morning stage and was in conference with Robert and the territorial marshal's representative for the entire afternoon. Rose waited. Thomas waited. Ernesto made coffee approximately 6 times. At 5 in the evening, Robert came out of the sheriff's office and walked directly to where Rose was standing in the street and said, "Fletcher will go to trial in Santa Fe in September. Thomas's testimony has been accepted. He has full immunity in exchange for his cooperation. The land fraud will be referred to the Civil Territorial Court. Harmon is charged separately. Rose took a breath. Let it out. Augustin Reyes, she said. I wrote to the lawyer in Santa Fe last week, Robert said. He has agreed to take the case. It is not certain, but it is possible. She nodded. And then, because she was in the main street of Cimarron with Ernesto 20 feet away and Thomas watching from the porch and the whole small town going about its business around them, she did not do what she wanted to do, which was step forward and put her arms around him. Instead, she said very quietly, "Well done." He said, equally quietly, "We." She looked at him. "Well done," he said. "We." Thomas left for Ohio 2 weeks later. He was thin and subdued and very clearly in the process of rethinking the entire shape of his life, which Rose thought was probably appropriate. She stood at the stage and hugged him for a long time, and he said into her hair, "Are you coming home?" "Not yet," she said. He pulled back and looked at her. "Abbott," he said. "Among other things," she said, "I have work here. I'm going to help Robert prepare the case files for the Santa Fe trial, and she hesitated. There is a family in Taos I want to see settled properly before I decide anything." Thomas looked at her for a long moment with the perceptive eyes of a younger brother who had grown up watching a person and knowing her. "You are happy here," he said. "Yes," she said, somewhat surprised to hear herself say it so cleanly. "Good," he said. "Tell Mother I am fine. Tell her I will write." "Tell her yourself," she said. He grinned, the first real grin she had seen from him since she arrived, and climbed onto the stage, and Rose stood in the street until the stage was out of sight, and then she turned back toward town and found Robert standing a respectful distance behind her, his hat in his hands. "He is a good man underneath all the trouble," Robert said. "He is," she said. "He just needed to be scared enough to find it." They walked back into town together in the morning light, and Rose noticed that they had without discussion aligned to walk side by side, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and that it felt entirely natural, and that she was, unquestionably, happy. The weeks after Thomas left had a different quality. The urgency of the danger was gone, and what replaced it was something gentler but no less intense, a daily deepening of the thing between them that Rose was no longer pretending was not what it was. She stayed in her room at the St. James and continued to help Ernesto and Robert organize the case materials for the September trial. And in the evenings, they walked along the river or sat on the hotel porch or played cards in the lobby with Ernesto and his wife Elena, who had appeared one Sunday afternoon and installed herself in the social landscape of Rose's life, with the pleasant decisiveness of a woman who has decided to adopt someone. Elena Villarreal was 26 and had been born in the territory and spoke 4 languages and had opinions about everything, delivered in a rapid, affectionate commentary that Rose found enormously refreshing after a lifetime of polite Ohio reticence. Elena told her the second time they met that everyone in Cimarron had been talking about her since the day she walked into the Silver Bell Saloon and told Deke Harmon to stop, and that the general consensus was that she was either very brave or very foolish or probably both, and that the town had tentatively decided it liked her. "What about you?" Rose asked. "What did you decide?" Elena smiled. "I decided before that. Ernesto came home after the first week and told me about you. He said he had never seen a woman organize a case file the way you did. He said you reorganized everything he had done in 3 days and made it 3 times clearer. He said," she paused for effect, clearly enjoying herself, "that Abbott looked at you when you were not watching like a man who had just found water in the desert." Rose felt the color come up in her face. "Ernesto said that." "Not exactly in those words," Elena said cheerfully. "But that was what he meant." She told this to Robert that evening on their walk, partly because she could not keep it to herself and partly because she had decided that one of the things she valued most about what was between them was the honesty of it, and she wanted to keep it honest. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see in his profile that he was simultaneously embarrassed and trying not to be, and the combination was endearing. "Ernesto is perceptive," he said finally. He is, she said. Was he right? Robert stopped walking. They were at the spot along the river they had come to think of as theirs, where the cottonwoods were thickest and the bank was wide and flat and the mountains were visible in the distance. He turned and looked at her. "Rose," he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "Are you going home to Ohio? After the trial? Are you going back?" She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had been thinking about her mother, who was practical and sharp-minded, and had a neighbor woman who came in most days and was, if Rose was honest with herself, less dependent on Rose's presence than Rose had perhaps believed. She had been thinking about the life she had left, the small house, the sewing work she did for 3 ladies in town, the church socials and the familiar streets and the reliable, unchanging predictability of it. She had been thinking about this land and its enormous sky, and the way the light came down in the morning, and the way the mountains looked at dusk, and the way she felt when she was here in this place, doing work that mattered. She had been thinking about him. "I do not know yet what my life here looks like," she said carefully, "but I know that when I try to imagine leaving, something in me refuses." He was very still. "I came here looking for Thomas," she said, "and I found him. And I found this place, and I found—" She stopped, looked at him, let him see what was in her face. "I found something I did not know to want, and I find that I want it very much." He closed the distance between them and kissed her, and it was quiet and certain and nothing like a question, and Rose felt it in every part of herself, the rightness of it, the deep settling recognition, the sense of something that had been waiting to happen finally, cleanly, beautifully happening. When they separated, she looked up at him and said, "That has been building for quite some time." "Approximately since you told a man with a gun to stop," he said. "And he did," she laughed. He looked at her laughing, and his expression was so full of something she could only call joy that she had to look away for a moment because it was almost too much to hold. She wrote to her mother the following day. She said, "I am staying in New Mexico territory for the foreseeable future. I am well. I have found honest and important work and good people and something more that I will explain when there is more to explain. Do not worry about me. For the first time in my adult life, I am not worried about myself." Her mother wrote back, "In the 3-week delay of mail between the territory and Ohio, your letter arrived. I am not surprised. You always did go further than you set out to. I will tell Mrs. Pierce she can have your Tuesday afternoon slot at the lending library. Write to me. Be careful, be happy. Be happy," Rose thought, reading it. "Mother." She folded the letter and put it in her traveling bag with the 7 others she had received since arriving, and went out into the brilliant morning to do her work. The summer in the territory was fierce and golden, and entirely unlike anything Rose had experienced. The heat came down from the sky and rose up from the earth, and the light was so constant and so bright that she took to wearing a wider hat and keeping a damp cloth at her workstation in the sheriff's office. The mountains on clear days were so sharp and close that they seemed painted on the sky, and the thunderstorms that rolled in from the west on summer afternoons were tremendous and magnificent, lightning running through the clouds like something alive, rain coming down in curtains so thick you could not see across the street. She loved it. Unreservedly and somewhat to her own astonishment, she loved all of it. She and Robert moved with a careful, mutually respectful deliberateness through the summer, building something solid rather than rushing. They were not clandestine. The town knew, Alina knew, Ernesto knew and had clearly known before they did, but they were private about the deep things, keeping them between themselves, which felt right to both of them. They talked about everything. About his years in Missouri and the choices he had made and the long work of becoming who he was now. About her childhood and her father and the particular loneliness of being the responsible one when responsibility was thrust on you before you were ready for it. About the land and the law and the territory's complicated position in 1882, a place still raw and contested, the Comanche and the Jicarilla Apache having ceded land under pressures that Robert named plainly as injustice, the Maxwell land grant dispute still unsettled, the railroad changing everything faster than the land could absorb it. He was not a man who simplified things, and neither was she, and that matched between them like two halves of the same coin. The Fletcher trial was held in Santa Fe in September 1882. Rose and Robert made the trip south together with the case files and Thomas's written deposition, and the trial lasted 4 days and ended with Warren Fletcher convicted on 6 counts of livestock theft, 3 counts of fraud, and 2 counts of criminal intimidation of witnesses. He was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. Deke Harmon, tried separately the following week, received 8 years for his role in the intimidation of Thomas and several other witnesses who had come forward once Fletcher was behind bars. On the evening after the verdict, Robert and Rose sat in the courtyard of the Posada de Santa Fe where they had taken rooms, under a sky so thick with stars it looked solid, and Rose felt the full settled weight of what had been accomplished. "Raise," she said. "The lawyer is filing the civil complaint next month," Robert said. "It will take time, but the evidence is solid. I believe he will win it." "I want to go to Taos," she said, "to tell him." "We can go on the way back," Robert said. "There is a road." "Yes," she said. He took her hand, which had become, over the summer, entirely natural and entirely essential. "Rose," he said, "I need to ask you something." "You have been saying that for 6 months," she said. He looked at her with that expression, warm and precise and entirely open. "This time what I want to ask is different." She turned to face him. "I know you came here for Thomas," he said, "and I know you stayed past what was necessary because you are the kind of person who sees things through. And I know that somewhere in the middle of all of that, something happened between us that neither of us planned. And I know that you have built a life here in 5 months that would take most people 5 years, because you are extraordinary and because this land recognizes extraordinary people and keeps them." He paused. "I am asking you to stay. Not for the case or for Thomas or for the work, though the work is good and you are remarkable at it. I am asking you to stay for me. I am asking you to consider making a life here that is ours." The stars above the courtyard were so bright they cast faint shadows. "Robert Abbott," Rose said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said. "If you will, I am." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had come west to outrun his past and had remade himself into something steady and honest and good. This man who had looked at her across a saloon floor with a gun at his head and communicated more clearly with his eyes than most people managed in words. This man who had treated her as an equal from the first hour and had shared his darkest history and had waited patiently through a summer of careful building and had brought her to a courtyard of stars to ask a question that she had known for months was coming. "Yes," she said, "I will." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her fingers, and it was the most formal and the most tender thing, and she felt it everywhere, and when he looked up at her his face was open and clear and entirely happy. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. And then she laughed and he laughed, and the stars were the same stars that had hung over this country for 10,000 years, watching everything, forgetting nothing, and they were part of it now, woven into it. They went to Taos the next day, Rose and Robert on horseback, taking the high road north through the mountains in the October light, the aspens gone gold along the ridges and the air carrying a bite that promised autumn's full arrival. Taos was a beautiful town, the pueblo a vast ancient adobe structure that had stood for 600 years, the streets dusty and lined with cottonwoods, and the light the same luminous quality that Rose had first noticed when she came to the territory, and had never stopped finding extraordinary. Augustin Reyes was a quiet man of 45 with a careful face and steady hands, and he received them in the small house in Taos where his family was staying with his wife's parents. His wife, Lupe, brought out coffee and pan dulce and sat with folded hands while Rose explained, as clearly and directly as she could, that a lawyer in Santa Fe was filing a civil complaint on his behalf regarding the Fletcher land fraud, and that the prospects for reclaiming his property were reasonable. Reyes was silent for a long time after she finished. Then he said, in English that was slow and deliberate, "You did this for us." "Robert began it," Rose said. "He has been building the case for 8 months. I only added a few pieces." Reyes looked at Robert. "I was told," he said, "by the men who burned my buildings that the law here worked for men like Fletcher. That there was no point complaining." "Those men were wrong," Robert said. "The law here works for everyone who lives here, or it is supposed to. When it fails that standard, it is the job of people in this work to correct it. I am sorry it took this long." Reyes was quiet again. Then he said, "When we can go back, when the land is ours again, I would like you to come. Both of you. I want my children to meet the people who made it possible." Rose looked at Robert and he looked at her, and the understanding passed between them without words. "We will come," Rose said. They were married in Cimarron in November 1882 at the church that was still losing its slow argument with the wind, on a cold, bright day when the mountains had their first snow, and the sky was the deep, impossible blue of the territory in late fall. Elena Villarreal stood with Rose and wept enthusiastically and unapologetically throughout the ceremony. Ernesto stood with Robert and maintained his composure until Robert said his vows, at which point Ernesto pressed his lips together very tightly and looked at the ceiling. Rose's mother came from Ohio, which Rose had not expected and which undid her entirely when the woman stepped off the stage in her good traveling coat and simply opened her arms. Her mother held her for a long time and said nothing, and then stood back and looked at her with sharp, knowing eyes and said, "You look like yourself." "What does that mean?" Rose asked. "I am not sure I could have told you what it meant before I saw it," her mother said, "but you look like who you were supposed to be." Thomas came too, arriving on the same stage as their mother, thinner than he had been but with a straighter spine, and he shook Robert's hand at the church door and said, in a low voice, "You take care of her." Robert looked at him levelly and said, "She takes care of herself. What I do is stand beside her." Thomas thought about this for a moment and then said, "That is the correct answer." The ceremony was simple and honest, which was the only kind Rose would have had. The words they exchanged were the traditional ones, promising fidelity and care and constancy. And when Rose said them, she meant each one precisely and completely, and she could see in Robert's eyes that he did too. And the minister said, "You are married." And the small church full of people, Ernesto and Elena, the hotel proprietor and his wife, several townspeople who had decided the event was worth attending, and one woman from the dry goods store who had sold Rose more thread than she had used, and seemed to feel this, gave her a personal connection to the proceedings, applauded with warm and genuine feeling. That night in the house on Cedar Street that Robert had rented for them, a low adobe building with 3 rooms, a fireplace in the main room, a kitchen window that faced east and caught the morning light, a porch where you could see the mountains, Rose stood in the kitchen and looked at the fire he had made against the November cold and thought about the word her mother had used. Supposed to be. She had come to the territory to find Thomas. She had found him. She had found the case and the work and the land and the light and the people and this man. And she had built, in 8 months, in this raw and ancient and beautiful place, the life that was hers. Not the life anyone had described for her or planned for her or expected of her. Not the life she had been managing from obligation and duty and fear. Her own life. The one that fit. She heard Robert come in from the porch and she turned and he came to her and put his arms around her from behind and she leaned back into him, and they stood by the fire in their house on Cedar Street in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory in the late fall of 1882, and it was perfectly quiet and perfectly good. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I did not know what I was looking for," she said. "When I came here, I knew I was looking for Thomas, but that is not," she paused. "I did not know I was looking for this. I did not know to want it. And now I know," she said. "It is not something you can know until you have it." He pressed his lips to the top of her head gently. "Neither can I," he said. The winter was cold and full of snow and entirely beautiful, and Rose and Robert settled into the days with the ease of 2 people who had been waiting their whole lives for someone to be easy with. She continued to work with Ernesto on legal documentation, which had expanded beyond the Fletcher case into a more general assistance to the sheriff's office that she and Robert had quietly formalized into a paid position, something that required some negotiation with the territory's administrative apparatus and some of Robert's careful, patient application of political will, but which resulted in Rose Keller Abbott becoming, in January 1883, the first paid female legal administrative officer in Cimarron County, a fact that Alina greeted with a party, and that Rose greeted with the quiet satisfaction of something that was right being made official. In February, a letter arrived from the lawyer in Santa Fe regarding the Ray's land case. The territorial civil court had ruled in Ray's favor. The land by the Cimarron River was returned to Augustin Ray's, and the costs of Fletcher's fraud were ordered to be paid from the assets seized at his arrest. The letter was short and factual, and Rose read it at her desk in the sheriff's office and then set it down very carefully and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk and something burning behind her eyes. Ernesto, at his desk across the room, looked up and said, "Good news." "Yes," she said. "You are going to cry," he observed. "I am not," she said. She cried very briefly, and Ernesto made no comment whatever and handed her his handkerchief with the silent efficiency of a man who knew when to say nothing. Robert came in an hour later, and she showed him the letter, and he read it and looked up at her with an expression she knew completely by now, the open warmth underneath the careful surface, and he said, "We should go to Taos and tell them." "Yes," she said, "we should." They went in March, when the roads were passable again, and Augustin Ray's received the news with a stillness that Rose had come to understand was not absence of feeling but its fullest presence, the stillness of a man absorbing something too large for immediate expression. And then he said, "We will go back in spring, when the ground is soft enough to plant." And his wife, Lupe, took Rose's hands in both of hers and said something in Spanish that Rose did not entirely follow, but which Ernesto, who had come with them, translated as, "She says you are a woman who came from elsewhere and saw what was ours and made sure it was given back. She says the land will remember this." Rose thought about that for a long time. The land will remember this. She thought about the land she had come from and the land she had come to, and the difference between a place where you were managing and a place where you were living, and what it meant to be seen by a place, to be recognized by it, to be kept by it. She thought, "I am kept by this country, and it is mine now in the way that things are yours when you have worked for them and fought for them and chosen them." In the spring of 1883, 3 things happened that Rose would remember for the rest of her life. The first was that Augustin and Lupe Ray's returned to their land on the Cimarron River. Their 4 children piled into the wagon with everything they owned, and planted their first spring crop in soil that was legally, irrevocably theirs. Rose and Robert rode out to see them on planting day, and the Ray's children, ranging from 6 to 14, ran in the freshly turned earth with a freedom that was almost painful to watch. And Augustin stood at the fence line of his property and put his hand on the post and looked at his land with an expression that needed no translation. The second was that Robert was appointed sheriff of Cimarron County in April, Sheriff Caldwell having retired to his daughter's house in Colorado, and Rose watched him accept the appointment with the focused gravity of a man who took the weight of things seriously, and she felt so proud of him she thought she might simply come apart from it. The third was that Rose realized, on a bright morning in late April, that she was pregnant. She told Robert that evening on the porch, watching the mountains in the last light, and he went very still in the way he went still when something was significant, and then he turned to her with an expression so entirely open and undisguised that she felt as though she were seeing all of him at once, everything he had been and everything he had chosen to become and everything he was now here in this moment with her. "Rose," he said. "I know," she said. "I am still calculating how I feel about it." "How do you feel about it?" She thought about it seriously, which was the only way she thought about things. She felt the shift the news created in the landscape of her life, the new dimension of it, the responsibility and the wonder of it. I feel as though something that was already very large has become larger, she said. I feel she stopped, tried again. I feel like the territory the first time I saw it from the stage window, like I could not have imagined it before I was looking at it. He took her hand. She looked at him. And you, she said. I feel like a man who has been given more than he deserves, he said. You deserve everything you have, she said firmly. Do not say that. I am trying to express gratitude, he said. You may express it differently, she said. You have remade yourself into a good man. You deserve the life that comes with it. He looked at her for a long moment. You are the most rigorous person I have ever encountered, he said. I will take that as the compliment I believe you intended as, she said. He brought her hand to his lips. Their son was born in December 1883. A healthy boy who came into the world in the middle of a snowstorm, with Elena Villarreal present, because the doctor was on the other side of the county and Robert was in the main room trying not to pace a groove in the floor. They named him James, after no one in particular but a name they both liked, and he was small and furious and entirely himself from the first hour, which Rose found entirely apt. Robert held him that first night with the careful, absolute tenderness of a large man handling something irreplaceable, and Rose watched from the bed, still exhausted but clear-eyed, and thought, this is it. This is all of it, the whole gathered weight of having made the right choice, the whole extraordinary consequence of walking through a saloon door in the wrong town looking for a brother and finding, instead, everything. James was 3 months old when a letter arrived from Thomas in Ohio saying he had met a woman, a schoolteacher named Clara, and that he intended to marry her in June, and asking if Rose and Robert could come home for the wedding. Rose wrote back, "We will come if the baby cooperates with travel. He probably will not. We will try anyway. Congratulations, Thomas. Being found by a good person is the best thing that happens to most of us." They went to Ohio in June 1884 for Thomas and Clara's wedding, and it was the first time Rose had been back in 2 years, and she stood in the small Ohio church where she had been baptized and married people she had known all her life, and felt the full doubling of it. The strangeness of being returned to a familiar place as a different person, and the deep-rootedness of having come from somewhere, having a before as well as a now. Her mother held James for the entire afternoon and said to Robert, with the directness of a woman who has survived hard things and knows her mind, "You are a good man. I can see it. I am glad she found you." Robert said, "She found herself, Mrs. Keller. I am grateful she let me walk beside her." Rose, overhearing this, thought, "He is going to make me cry twice in one day, and I have never cried twice in a day in my life, and I do not intend to start now." She did not cry. She went and stood beside him and took his arm and looked at the room full of people she loved, here and also in the territory, and felt the full dimension of a life that had expanded beyond anything a girl in Ohio with a leather bag and $42 in her boot could have anticipated. They went home to Cimarron in July. James learned to walk in the fall, steady on his legs and deeply interested in everything, dragging himself upright against the furniture and setting off across the floor with the focused determination that Rose recognized as a family trait. Robert lay on the floor and held his arms out, and the boy walked into them, and it was simple and perfect. In 1885, Augustin Reyes came to town for the first time since returning to his land, bringing his wife and all 4 children, and they had dinner at Rose and Robert's house on Cedar Street, and Lupe brought tamales she had made from corn grown on their returned land, and they sat around the table and ate and talked and laughed, and Rose looked around the table at these people. The Reyes family, Ernesto and Elena, who had come with their own son, born the previous spring, and Robert beside her with James asleep against his shoulder, and felt the room as a kind of proof, a tangible collected evidence of the choices that had brought them all here, the justice that had been done, and the life. that had been built from it. She thought about what Lupe had said at the Taos River house. The land will remember this. She looked at her husband and he looked at her, and in the look was everything. The saloon floor and the river walk and the courtyard in Santa Fe and the church in November, and all the evenings and the mornings and the work and the loss and the finding. The whole long, beautiful thread of it. In 1886, their second child was born, a girl they named Margaret, which had been Robert's grandmother's name. Margaret was utterly unlike James from the first week, calm where he had been furious, watchful where he had been active, taking in the world with wide, dark eyes that had her father's quality of careful attention. Rose watched her daughter watch things and thought, "She is going to be remarkable." Robert made a cradle for her, himself, in the evenings, from pine wood from the mountains, and Rose sat in the kitchen doorway and watched him work, and felt the deep, warm, ordinary joy of a life lived fully in its own time and place. In the evenings, sometimes, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Rose would sit on the porch and look at the mountains and think about the woman who had packed a bag in Ohio with $42 and one brother's letter and no idea what she was walking into. She thought about that woman with a great tenderness, as though she were someone slightly separate, someone she had left behind at a stage stop in Kansas and never quite retrieved. She thought, "You could not have known. You could not have known any of it, but you walked forward anyway, and that was the whole of it." Cimarron grew in the late 1880s, as the territory changed and the railroad brought people, and the land disputes slowly settled into something approaching law. Robert served as sheriff for 10 years, and his tenure was known for its fairness and its stubborn commitment to the principle that the law served everyone who lived under it. The Mexican families who had been here before the territory became a territory. The Jicarilla Apache who had seen their world remade by forces they could not stop. The homesteaders and the ranchers and the merchants and the drifters, all of them. Rose continued her work and expanded it, eventually helping to establish a small lending library at the church and a school supplemental program for children whose parents had come to the territory too recently to have organized a proper education. She wrote letters to her mother every 2 weeks for 20 years until her mother died quietly in Ohio in 1893, and she read every one of the letters back to herself afterward, seeing in them the record of a life, fully and honestly lived. Thomas and Clara came to visit twice, bringing their 3 children, and the cousins ran together in the territory sunshine while the adults sat on the porch and talked. And Thomas said once, on a late afternoon with the mountains going red in the sunset, "I used to feel guilty about the letter, about calling you into all of it." "Do not," Rose said. "I have told you this." "I know," he said, "but sometimes I think about what your life would have been if I had not written." Rose thought about this seriously, which was the only way she thought about anything. "It would have been fine," she said, "probably, quiet and respectable and fine." But she looked at the mountains, at the last red light on the peaks, at James and his cousins chasing something through the field, at Margaret sitting on the fence watching them with that careful, intelligent gaze. But not this. It would not have been this. Thomas followed her gaze. "No," he said, "not this." In 1892, Robert came home one evening and told her he was thinking of not seeking reappointment to the sheriff's office. He was 41 and had been carrying the badge for a decade, and the territory was changing in ways that required a different kind of law, and he thought Ernesto, who had been his deputy for the full decade and who had grown into one of the finest law enforcement officers in the region, was the right person for what came next. Rose listened to all of this and then said, "What do you want to do instead?" He had thought about this. He said slowly, "There is a ranch property on the river, 20 acres. Good land, well-watered, timber access." I thought. He looked at her. "I thought about cattle, a small operation, honest work, physical work, something I can build with my hands and pass on." "Yes," she said. He stopped. "You have not heard the full proposal." "Yes," she said again. "I heard enough. If that is what you want, let us do it." He looked at her with that expression she had known for 10 years and that still, every time, made her feel as though she were standing by the river in the first spring evening, close enough to him that she could feel the warmth of him, everything still ahead. "I will need a partner," he said. "You have one," she said. They bought the ranch in the spring of 1893 and called it the Cedar Creek Ranch, and spent the rest of that year building it into something real. It was hard work and good work, and Rose was 45 miles from the nearest city and entirely satisfied with this. James, at 10, learned to ride and to manage cattle with the focused intensity he brought to everything, and Margaret, at 7, followed him everywhere and insisted on being taught everything he was taught, which Robert obliged without hesitation, to the mild scandal of 1 or 2 people in town and the complete indifference of everyone who knew the family. Ernesto was appointed sheriff in 1893 and served for 15 years, and was remembered as one of the finest officers the county had known. He and Alina remained the closest friends Rose and Robert had, and they celebrated together births, harvests, the occasional unexpected windfall, the small and steady accumulations of a life built well. Augustin Reyes died in 1898 and his land passed to his eldest son, who farmed it and kept it. And at the service, Rose and Robert sat with Lupe and held her hands and said what could be said, which was not much but was genuine. The years moved, as years do, through the changing light of the territory. The winters of snow and silence, the springs of enormous sky and green coming up along the river, the summers of heat and thunderstorms, the falls of gold in the aspens and red on the mountains. James grew into a young man who was steady and honest, and who, at 20, met a young woman from a ranch family in Mora County named Sophia, and married her in the kind of ceremony that was simple and full of meaning. And Rose watched her son take his wife's hands and felt the thread of it, the long, continuous thread. Margaret studied at a school in Santa Fe and came home with ideas and arguments and a fierce, clear-eyed engagement with the world that made her parents proud in the way that is almost uncomfortable, too much feeling compressed into too small a chest. Rose Keller Abbott, at 50, was not the woman who had packed a bag in Ohio with $42 and one brother's letter. She was something else entirely, weathered and certain, and rooted in the territory like one of the cottonwoods along the Cimarron River, her roots going deep into the land, and the water and the long history of the place she had chosen, and that had chosen her back. She was on the porch of Cedar Creek Ranch on an October evening in 1908, the year she turned 50, watching the mountains go through their evening transformation from gold to red to purple, when Robert came and sat beside her with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable ease of a man who has moved through a house and a life for 26 years and knows where everything is. He sat down and handed her a cup, and she took it, and they sat in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have shared enough time that silence is its own language. After a while he said, "What are you thinking?" It was a question he had asked her 1,000 times. She had 1,000 answers. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "about a woman on a train in March of 1882, watching Indiana go by out the window and trying to imagine what the territory would look like. Could she imagine it? No, Rose said. Not any of it." He was quiet. "She thought she was going to find her brother and go home," Rose said. "She had no larger plan. She thought the biggest thing that would happen to her was that she would retrieve Thomas from whatever trouble he had gotten himself into and go back to Ohio and resume being sensible." "Sensible," he said, and there was warmth in the word. "It is very overrated," she said. He laughed, low and genuine, and she looked at him in the evening light, this man she had known for 26 years and chosen every day of them, this man who had been remade and had remade himself and who had stood beside her in everything, and she felt the full weight of it, the gratitude and the love and the deep satisfied certainty of a life that had been, against all odds and without a plan, exactly right. "Robert," she said. "Yes. I am glad I walked through that saloon door." He looked at her. In his face was everything she had ever seen in it, the care and the warmth and the open honesty, and underneath all of it, the same thing she had seen on a saloon floor 26 years ago when he had looked at her across the room with a gun at his head and communicated more clearly than most people managed in words. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The mountains went dark in the east, and the stars began their slow, enormous appearance, one by one and then in their thousands, the same stars that had hung above this country for longer than anyone could count. The Cimarron River moved in the darkness below the ranch. James and Sophia's light was on in the house at the far end of the property. Margaret's most recent letter was on the kitchen table, full of her opinions about the world. Rose and Robert sat on the porch of Cedar Creek Ranch and drank their coffee in the dark, and the territory stretched around them in every direction, ancient and enormous and indifferent to human plans. The land that had kept her, the land that had remembered, the land that had given her, in exchange for one brother and $42 and one great act of obstinate courage, everything she had not known to want and could not now imagine living without. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was a life.